Let's focus on what you said about accountability. How do you think, I mean, post the civil war in Sri Lanka, how do you think accountability and transparency can be achieved?
To talk with people around the country, and not just in the North and East, but obviously also in the North and East. And they feel like there's been so much time that's passed and so many people have come to ask them the same questions over and over again, and they never get answers to their questions of what happened to their loved ones. Sadly, there have been cases of people going missing in other parts of the country, cases of journalists going missing as well. Because if your son went missing, or if your husband went missing, it's very difficult to tell someone, well, just get over it.
Right.
You know, it happened a long time ago, you should just move on, because you don't want to give up on them. How there has to be a bit of an openness, there has to be a bit of a sense that, you know, yes, terrible things happen in this country, but if we really want to be moving together successfully in the future, we have to actually figure out what those were and talk about them and have those conversations, even if they're difficult conversations. And I think that if we had a Sri Lanka where everybody in the whole country, north to south, east to west, central, upcountry, everybody felt like this was their country. They could speak their language, they could practice their religion, and they wouldn't have to worry that somebody might come one day and say, oh, you know what? We're going to have to stop you there. You're going to have to speak the majority language. You're going to have to know the majority religion. And when I see Sri Lanka, I see kind of the same thing. There was an indigenous community here before any Buddhists or Hindus were here. There are 2 languages in the Constitution plus English. A lot of people that love their country, and when the sports team plays, just like in Canada, everybody gets behind it, you know.
Absolutely.
So I feel like there's so much potential here, and it's just a question of figuring out how do we get from where we are now to that future point.
Welcome everyone, you're watching Conversations with Alanki. Good foreign relations and diplomacy is intrinsic in today's closely connected world. Canada is home to many Sri Lankans, and Canada-Sri Lanka ties go way back. Today I will be in conversation with His Excellency Eric Walsh, the High Commissioner of Canada, Sri Lanka and the Maldives. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for being a part of this conversation. How are you doing?
I'm wonderful. Welcome to Canada House.
Thank you for having us here. Getting straight to it, tell us about your tenure in Sri Lanka so far. How has it been? You witnessed Sri Lanka go through turbulent times, such as the economic crisis and the revolutionary people's movement.
Well, I arrived after the bulk of the street protests had been concluded. We got here in December 2022. We're very happy to get here, actually, because we left a snowstorm in Canada to arrive
Right.
in beautiful December weather in Sri Lanka. But it was really surprising to me the depth of the economic disruption here. You know, it seems like this country has been quite successful in the past, and the events of 2022, it seemed, really shook the foundation of what people expected the country to be able to provide. And so that was really interesting to see. But what also really surprised me was the resilience of the Sri Lankan people. The fact that there were so many people who were trying to make things work despite all of the challenges, trying to make things work for their kids as well. Canada was able to help a little bit in terms of some emergency assistance, but really the actual strength of the Sri Lankan people and their desire to make this a better place was really evident as well. So that really struck me when I arrived.
All right. I do have to agree with you. Sri Lankan people are rather resilient. What are the notable developments between Sri Lanka and Canada during your tenure?
So I arrived, as I mentioned, in December, and in January there was quite a big announcement out of Canada when we put sanctions on a number of Sri Lankan citizens, including 2 former presidents. That was quite a big change to our relationship up until that point. And to me, that would be quite, you know, when you combine that with, then a few months later, the recognition in our House of Commons, the anniversary of that recognition, declaring that May 18th would be Tamil Genocide Recognition Day. Those were 2 pretty big events that happened while I was here that changed a little bit the Canada-Sri Lanka relationship. It really reinforced some of the things that Canada's been saying for quite some time about the importance of reconciliation, about accountability, about actually just getting to the facts and the truth of what happened, and so many people that lost their lives, lost family members, or had them go missing, and need to be able to figure that out. So those are two things that happened that I think would be familiar to many people that would be watching this interview. But some other things happened which may be a little bit lesser known. One of them is that, and I don't think this happened while I was here, but I became aware of it while I was here. A lot of people in Sri Lanka tell me this, including contacts of the foreign ministry, that the Sri Lankan community in Canada, and you mentioned this in your opening, is actually the single largest Sri Lankan diaspora outside of the country. That to me seems very surprising, because Canada's very far away. Canada is not blessed with the same weather here. We don't have the same wonderful natural beauty, at least it's a different kind of natural beauty. And also it's much more expensive than Sri Lanka. And yet, despite that, it seems that many people from this country have made their way across that long distance to make a new life. So that's one thing which to me is really, really notable, and really, I think, an important part of our relationship. Two other things that happened this year, which I'll just mention briefly since I've been here. One is that we had our first ever bilateral consultations at the Director General level. We had our Director General come to Sri Lanka. This was in July last year for bilateral consultations, covering the range of the relationship. Very important foundational piece in state-to-state relations between our two countries. And then also just last month, a group of university professors in Canada, in conjunction with the State Minister for Higher Education here, created the Canadian Network of Sri Lankan Academics. It's the first time such a thing has been created in any country in the world, although there may be others to follow. But this is university professors, it is senior administration members of universities and graduate students of Sri Lankan origin in Canada. At the very first meeting, they had over 100 people. Think about that. The number of actual academics in Canada from Sri Lanka, just at the first meeting, was over 100. And even at that meeting, they were getting more members and more people coming on and more people identifying other people to join the network. So the network is growing very fast. I'm very excited to see where that goes. I think it's going to be a very useful addition to the Canada-Sri Lanka diplomatic architecture.
Indeed. We will touch upon Sri Lankans living in Canada. But before that, let's focus on what you said about accountability. How do you think, post the civil war in Sri Lanka, how do you think accountability and transparency can be achieved?
So I think if there was an easy answer to that, somebody already would have found it. It would already have been done. I know there's a lot of people thinking about it and working on it. I know a lot of mechanisms have been established. The Office of Missing Persons, obviously, is an important one. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is being discussed now, is another one. But I also talk with people around the country, and not just in the North and East, but obviously also in the North and East. And they feel like there's been so much time that's passed, and so many people have come to ask them the same questions over and over again, and they never get answers to their questions of what happened to their loved ones. It's not just a question for the North and East either, right? Sadly, there have been cases of people going missing in other parts of the country, cases of journalists going missing as well. And as long as all of these questions are still out there, it's going to be very difficult, I think, to get closure for a lot of people. Now, any kind of solution has to bring in all the different groups that have an interest. Probably never going to be agreement between all of those groups about exactly what needs to happen. But having that conversation and figuring out who has the information that is needed in order to be shared. Is that information located somewhere? Is it spread across different agencies? Is it different people? Are there other ways we can get at it? It can't just be a question of saying, well, it's all happened in the past, let's just forget about it. Because if your son went missing, or if your husband went missing, it's very difficult to tell someone, well, just get over it.
Right.
You know, it happened a long time ago, you should just move on. Because you don't want to give up on them. You don't want to just, it's something that I wouldn't wish on anybody. You need answers, and you need to know not just that something happened, but also you want to know how it happened. You want to know where it happened, things like that. Maybe not everybody's going to get that. Maybe that information just simply doesn't exist. But I think at this point, we're not at that point. I think we have to keep asking and keep encouraging. From Canada's perspective, we're trying to encourage, right? Like, I have a lot of optimism. I'm an optimistic person, perhaps. Maybe that's not the right approach to take here. Maybe I should be more skeptical. But I see so much potential in this country. I see so many similarities between Sri Lanka and Canada, and I can talk about those in a little bit as well. But I really feel like somehow there has to be a bit of an openness. There has to be a bit of a sense that, yes, terrible things happen in this country, but if we really want to be moving together successfully in the future, we have to actually figure out what those were and talk about them and have those conversations, even if they're difficult conversations.
Like you said, there are many Sri Lankans in Canada. How has this impacted the bilateral relations between the two countries?
Well, I think, you mentioned that there's a lot of Sri Lankans in Canada, and the number is continuing to grow. So at the moment, the relationship between the countries is getting way too multifaceted for me to even keep track of. We have so many Sri Lankan students going to Canada, which is wonderful to see. We have so many Sri Lankan, as I mentioned, university professors, Sri Lankan doctors. We even have politicians in Canada of Sri Lankan origin, bureaucrats in Canada of Sri Lankan origin. And no matter where their origin is in Sri Lanka, they're interested in what's going on here. And they're paying attention to what I'm doing, they're paying attention to what the Canadian government is doing in terms of our relationship with Sri Lanka. That's not unique to Sri Lanka in Canada's case. We have lots of large diaspora communities from lots of different countries, including India, including many other countries in South Asia, including China. And it has an impact in that in Canada, when people think of their foreign relations, if they have a personal connection, then they want to see that connection reflected in the relationship. They don't want it just to be a question of state to state. The importance of the people-to-people relations, I think, is critical for us as we think about how Canada's role is on the international stage. Canada has become, it's not a perfect country by any means, and I don't want to give the impression that I'm trying to sugarcoat all the issues that may exist, but we have a very multicultural society. In fact, I think the statistic I saw from 2021 is that 23% of Canadians at one point were immigrants or permanent residents. So in other words, almost a quarter of people who are now Canadian, who have Canadian passports, in 2021 at least, this was the stat, I think it might have even gone up since then, almost a quarter of people with Canadian passports at some point weren't Canadian. So either they moved to Canada or they were born outside and then they got Canadian citizenship later. That's the highest percentage it's ever been since Confederation in Canada, since 1867. So Canada is in almost a new territory where we are Canadian, but we are also global citizens. And that has an impact on how we undertake our foreign policy, because so many people in Canada have personal ties to what's happening in other countries. So I would say there's a lot of pressure from the community in Canada to do things a certain way. But I would say that pressure is very positive in a lot of ways as well. We have Canadians that are donating medical equipment to hospitals. We have Canadians, I was just in an event a few weeks ago, that are donating a science lab to a school. Because we have so many Canadians that saw what happened in this country over the last few years and the ones that have done well, want to be giving back to this country, want to be trying to help. So I think to me that's the story that I'm trying to develop as well.
There are, many Sri Lankans who want to get citizenship in Canada, especially after the economic challenges faced by Sri Lankans. Does the government support immigration at the moment? And if so, what type of immigration do they support?
So the very first thing is the government supports immigration. We have had some issues recently because so many people have been coming to Canada, as I mentioned. In fact, one of the impacts that we've discovered is that we don't have enough housing for everybody.
Right.
So prices are going up, people are living in smaller spaces, people are living with each other, and this is affecting international students. This terrible story you probably saw about this incident in Ottawa a few weeks ago. I won't talk about the details of it, but it was a large family, and they had a friend living with them, and they had this younger man living in their basement. Unfortunately, that's, I think, the case for many people in Canada now. They're trying to find ways to have more people in housing. So that's led to a little bit of a question. If we're going to have so many people coming to Canada, we have to figure out where we're going to put everybody. And so
Right.
we're trying to, put a little bit of a break on while we figure that out. But the overall approach to immigration is still very much the same, still very supportive. The numbers that we had been targeting, Canada's country, we're just about 40 million people. I think we're going to hit 41 million this year. And we had been targeting 500,000 new migrants to Canada every year. That's across all the different areas. That's economic migrants, that's refugees, that's other classes as well. The shortest answer I can give you, and maybe I should have started with this, is we have a webpage, which is ircc.canada.ca. Anybody can go to that page. All the resources for how to migrate to Canada if you're interested. All of the, you can even do a little bit of a self-assessment. I'd like to go to Canada. What are my options? There's a page that you can look at that. You can do it in English and French. But I would say the other thing, which is also very obvious to me living here, is that I hope that people also stay in Sri Lanka. When I think about how the Sri Lankans are contributing to Canada, I think about how wonderful it is for Canada, but it's also a loss for Sri Lanka. So while there's obviously opportunities in Canada, it's certainly not, the streets aren't paved with gold. Not everybody who goes to Canada is successful, and so definitely take that decision very carefully.
All right. Moving on to the next question. There are many countries which are faced with economic challenges post-COVID. How has this impacted Canada?
So COVID was a big challenge for us. I remember I was in Ottawa when COVID hit. Ottawa might have been one of the better places to be for COVID because it's a very spread out city. It's not a very dense city. It's a city that a lot of people commute on foot or on bicycle or otherwise, not using public transit, which is another story. And of course, we have very distinct seasons. So you have people going out onto patios at a time when in Sri Lanka people would be wearing winter coats. When the pandemic hit, I remember it was a big shock. I think the government of Canada did its best to combine the best health advice that was available at any given time with economic support so that disruptions were as minimal as possible. Obviously, unemployment spiked like I'm sure it did in lots of countries. The economy took a downturn like it did in many countries, but we've done a good job of catching back up to where we would have been because the government put in place supports for people that lost their jobs, supports for businesses that couldn't stay open, even supports for rent. If you had a rent payments to make to your landlord, but you couldn't open your business, there was a way to get some of that money back from the government. Now, we're paying for that, right? The debt went up a lot in Canada. We have to figure out how we get that back under control. But overall, I would say, given the information that we had, and it was changing all the time in the early days, I think the government did a really good job of at least keeping Canadians safe and keeping the economy on its feet. A couple of things that we learned as well were about how to do things differently, right? Certainly in my office in Global Affairs Canada, a lot of people quickly learned how to do video conferencing. Now, what's ironic is that for years, people have been encouraging us, you don't have to have in-person meetings. You can take some days at home, take some days, go to a coffee shop. Don't all come into the office, because we were trying to think of ways to reduce the amount of rent we were paying for all the buildings we needed to be in. Now we have the opposite problem, but we learned about how to do all of these things. And I think also it was a benefit environmentally, because all of the commuting that used to take place, all of the traffic jams that used to take place, those have gotten much better. Now, I think probably we're going to get back to where we were at some point. But in the meantime, while a lot of people continue to work from home at least one day a week, we're reducing cars on the roads, we're reducing traffic jams, and that's better as well. So I think we learned a lot. Of course, I have to mention all of the amazing medical developments that took place, right? Like the fact that vaccines came to market so quickly. Canada made some investments there. Canada also supported UN programs to get vaccines into countries that maybe weren't able to purchase on the open market. I think the UN was involved in supporting that. And that now we're seeing maybe some of the vaccine technology that came out of COVID could be used for other diseases maybe that we didn't know we could have vaccinations for. So while obviously it was terrible and it was awful, and I'm certainly not hoping we get another pandemic anytime soon, I feel like let's not forget that we learned some things about it. Let's not forget those things we learned, and let's try to make the best of those and take something good out of this terrible situation.
All right. Interesting perspectives. Every experience in life shapes you. So how has your time in Sri Lanka shaped you as a diplomat?
That's a very good question. I think it's not finished shaping me yet, I would say, first off. But there's a lot of firsts for me in Sri Lanka. It's the first time I've been living in a country that has a half-hour time zone. So I'm still not used to that. I still haven't quite figured out what time it is in Canada when I'm trying to call back. It's the first time I've been in a country that doesn't have a winter. And that is very easy to get used to, I can tell you. And if it's shaped me at all, it's made me think this is the kind of country that I'd like to live in. But I would say mostly, I had an impression of myself before I came here as a pretty seasoned traveler. I'd been to lots of different parts of the world. I'd learned different languages. I understood different customs in different places. And I was pretty confident that I had things figured out. But I'd never been to South Asia. I'd never been to Sri Lanka, never been to India, never been to any of the countries in this area. And I realized that as much as I thought I knew everything, I really knew very little. And even though obviously the level of English here is very high and my ability to communicate with people in language is very good, very easy, the traditions and the customs here are something that I very much had to get used to. One of the things I told people in Canada before I left was, I'm probably going to make lots of mistakes when I arrive. So, give me 6 months. And during that 6 months, like if you see me making mistakes, like give me a call, send me a text, like try to help me figure out what I don't know. And then if after 6 months I'm still making those same mistakes, then yes, then complain, he doesn't get it, he's not doing a good job and everything. I'm well out of those 6 months now, so I don't have any excuses anymore. But I still feel like I'm learning a lot about how people communicate here, what is said and what is left unsaid, what I have to kind of understand. And that to me has been a real eye-opener. And I think, therefore, as a diplomat, I've realized that I'm never going to be at a point where I know everything. I'm always going to be learning. I'm always going to be trying to figure out sort of the difference between what they're saying and what they mean, or if there is a difference between what they're saying and what they mean. And that to me has been a real eye-opener.
All right, and what message would you take to the world about Sri Lanka?
Message to the world about Sri Lanka. Well, Sri Lanka is very much worth a visit, I guess. It's not always easy, especially if you're Sri Lankan, I think, to live in Sri Lanka. It's maybe easier if you're not Sri Lankan to live in Sri Lanka, frankly. But this is a wonderful country. I tell everybody how much I like it here, how much I like the food, how much I like the weather, how much I like the people. But really, I think there's so much potential here. I feel like when I talk with people, people want the same thing for Sri Lanka. They want it to be a prosperous country. They want it to be a peaceful country. And they want to be able to feel like they're at home here. And I think that's possible. I think that's an option. And I think that if we had a Sri Lanka where everybody in the whole country, north to south, east to west, central, upcountry, everybody felt like this was their country. They could speak their language, they could practice their religion, and they wouldn't have to worry that somebody might come one day and say, oh, you know what? We're going to have to stop you there. You're going to have to speak the majority language. You're going to have to know the majority religion. And in Canada, we have this experience as well. We have obviously a lot of different experiences, but we have two founding languages in Canada, English and French. We have the indigenous peoples who were there long before anybody was speaking English and French. And we have all these other languages and all of these other people from around the world that have come in the meantime. As I say, we haven't figured it out, but we've tried hard and we've done a lot of things. And when I see Sri Lanka, I see kind of the same thing. There was an indigenous community here before any Buddhists or Hindus were here. There are 2 languages in the constitution plus English. There is a lot of people that love their country, and when the sports team plays, just like in Canada, everybody gets behind it, you know.
Absolutely.
So I feel like there's so much potential here, and it's just a question of figuring out how do we get from where we are now to that future point and taking the necessary steps. And if Canada can be helpful, we'll be happy to do that. If other countries can be helpful, I'm sure they'll be happy to do that. Or if Sri Lanka can do it itself, that'll be great too. But that's my message, is that this country has so much potential, it's so beautiful, and the people deserve to be able to live in it in a way that they want to, in a peaceful and prosperous state.
And before we move on to the final question, how do you think Canada could help or assist Sri Lanka to achieve these goals?
So I don't know. I'm open to suggestions. I would say that we have a lot of experience in Canada of overcoming barriers. We've also identified a lot of barriers that we haven't yet overcome, that we're trying to work through. And I'd be very open to having conversation with people about those, or bringing people from Canada who know about this better than me to Sri Lanka to talk about these kinds of things. We have, obviously, we have a federation in Canada. I'm not saying that's the solution to everybody, but it's with powers devolved to different levels of government. That's proven successful for us in our very diverse community. We can talk about that. We can talk about how we do our language policy, how we make sure that people who speak an official language of Canada are able to get service in their chosen language wherever they are at federal government institutions, but recognizing that it still doesn't always work, and how can we make it better. Those are just a couple of examples, but I think that, you know, if there's any examples, if there's any experience that Canada has that could be beneficial for Sri Lanka, we're very happy to share that.
And now for the final question, what is your message for those in Sri Lanka who might be watching this right now?
Oh my goodness. I should have thought of this before, I guess. No, I would say it's don't give up hope. I feel like with everything that's happened over the last few years, and it's been incredible, you know, like the Easter bombings, COVID hitting, the economic crisis, the Argalea, and then even last year, I don't know if this is on the same level, but, you know, the Cricket World Cup didn't go very well, you know, which I think a lot of people were hoping would be able to distract them from their problems.
Sri Lankans get very disheartened if they don't win the World Cup.
I'm very sympathetic to that. We feel the same way about ice hockey in Canada.
I'm sure.
But I would say that there's so much potential here. There's an election coming up this year. I think it's so important for people to vote. It's so important for the vote to be counted, for people to feel like they have a say in how their government runs things. And that it's not always, it's a trite saying, but in English we have the saying, the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. In other words, when you're looking at something else, you see the good things about what you're looking at, and you see the bad things about yourself.
Right.
And I know that people have been through a lot here, and I know it's been really difficult. But there's an election coming up, chance to set the country on a course for the next few years, I think is an important one and shouldn't be missed.
All right. Thank you very much for this conversation. It was really wonderful having this conversation with His Excellency Eric Walsh, the High Commissioner of Canada to Sri Lanka and the Maldives. Thank you everyone for watching. Do remember, if you like my content, subscribe, like, comment, share. Your feedback is always valued. Thank you for watching. Stay safe and take care.